ancient Mesopotamian king Lugalzaggesi of Umma, who came to the throne around 2350 BCE, was perhaps the most ambitious ruler the world had seen up to that time. At the time, the city-state of Umma had been feuding with the neighboring kingdom of Lagash for generations. These battles were boundary wars, fights over which kingdom had the right to control the fields between them. Lagash was usually victorious. In stone inscriptions, one Lagash king after another boasted of his victories over Umma. But Lugalzaggesi changed that. A later writer described how Lugalzaggesi swept into Lagash and attacked 20 temples, shrines, and palaces. He set fire to 7 of the buildings and did major damage to 12 others. He also looted their treasuries. Again and again, the writer tells us, the Umma king carried off precious metal and lapis lazuli. He also destroyed the statues in 2 buildings, threw something valuable into a well, and ruined the barley crop belonging to the city god. Even if this account is exaggerated, it's clear that Lugalzaggesi was bent on bringing Lagash to its knees. You can imagine the impact on the people who lived there. It must have been a terrifying time. The inscription ends with a specific condemnation. This destruction was all the fault of King Lugalzaggesi of Umma, we are told, not of the king of Lagash. And the whole messy conquest was a sin against the god of Lagash. Cursing Lugalzaggesi, the writer says, "May Nidaba, the goddess of Lugalzaggesi, the Ensi of Umma, make him bear all these sins." But Lugalzaggesi wasn't done. After his conquest of Lagash, he was out to rule what he called the land, not just a couple of city-states. At this point, there was no word for all of Mesopotamia because it had never been politically united. It was just the land. Later, it would be known as Sumer and Akkad. Then, the Greeks called it Mesopotamia, and today we know it as Iraq. I should point out that in the minds of the people who lived in Sumer at this time, the world didn't extend far beyond the valley of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. Instead, the Mesopotamians believed they lived at the center of the world. After all, the sun rose and set at what seemed to be equal distances from them, and that put them square in the middle. They knew there was a sea to the north, the Mediterranean. They called it the Upper Sea. They also were familiar with the Persian Gulf to the south, just beyond Ur and Uruk. They called that the Lower Sea. Logically, they concluded there was a sea extending right around the land, at the edge of the world. So it would be a monumental achievement if a king could rule from the Upper Sea to the Lower Sea. No one had done this before, or even attempted to. Until Lugalzaggesi, the only type of king who existed in Mesopotamia was the king of a city-state. Lugalzaggesi had bigger ideas. When he said he was king of the land, he was claiming to rule all the city-states. Lugalzaggesi made this statement in an inscription on a vase found in Nippur, which was thought of as the religious capital of Mesopotamia. That was where the king of the gods, Enlil, had his home. In the inscription, Lugalzaggesi claims that Enlil, as the greatest god, had given him control of all the people, from the rising of the sun to the setting of the sun, and from the Lower Sea to the Upper Sea. Enlil gave him no rival, the inscription states. But the cities listed were all in southern Mesopotamia: Uruk, Ur, Larsa, Umma, Zabalam, and Der. So perhaps this achievement was something short of ruling over all of what is now Iraq and Syria. Perhaps instead, he unified all of southern Mesopotamia. Still, that would be no small feat. It was probably true, and he would have been the first. Interestingly, though, he doesn't mention conquests in this inscription. Although the later writer describes him as having destroyed Lagash, Lugalzaggesi doesn't brag about his military power in the inscription commissioned for him. Instead, he goes on and on about all the gods who supported him, 13 of them. He'd been given the kingship by Enlil himself, he said. and the god of heaven, An, watched him with a steadfast eye. The god Enki had given him understanding. The god Utu had pronounced his name, and so on. He then says that everyone he ruled was happy and in good cheer. The final part of the inscription is a blessing and prayer, asking Enlil to watch over him and his people, and asking for peace and prosperity. Lugalzaggesi calls himself the shepherd of his people, not the victorious conqueror. So perhaps he didn't want to mention the destructive side of things. He wanted to highlight his peaceful side. Some scholars think this suggests that he was a good diplomat who had managed to bring at least 6 city-states together as a confederation without conquering them all. Others think the inscription just wasn't the place where you'd mention conquests because it commemorated the peaceful quality of the kingdom he'd created. Either way, Lugalzaggesi had done something important for the history of Mesopotamia. He'd thought of a state that was bigger than his home city and the land around it. I should point out that the Mesopotamians weren't the first to have kings who united extensive areas of land under a single ruler. Egypt had been unified under a single king about 600 years earlier and had stayed unified. The Egyptians were on their 5th dynasty by the time of Lugalzaggesi. The Great Pyramids had been built. Weirdly, though, there's no clear evidence that the Mesopotamians had any contact with Egypt during this time. 1,000 years before, they had been trading, with Mesopotamian architectural and artistic styles showing up in Egypt. But in the early dynastic period, from around 2900 to 2300 BCE, nothing found to date shows that this relationship had continued. So perhaps it was a coincidence that a few Mesopotamian kings, like Lugalzaggesi, started thinking about expanding their kingdoms and ruling over a bigger area. You can't help but wonder, though, if Lugalzaggesi might have heard rumors about those powerful kings in Egypt. It wasn't that far away, and the Egyptians and Mesopotamians both got their building timber from Lebanon. So one might think that word could have spread, even if no concrete objects or textual references have been found to confirm contact. The Great Pyramids could hardly have gone unnoticed by any visitor to the Egyptian capital city. And you'd think that someone would have made it from the Nile to the Euphrates with a story about the immense power of the kings there. But for now, in the absence of evidence, we have to assume that 2 of the great world civilizations were living in happy ignorance of one another. Going back to Lugalzaggesi, the last known mention of him is very different from his impressive portrayal in the earlier inscriptions. An even more powerful king brought Lugalzaggesi's reign to an end. This was King Sargon, whose royal inscription states, "Sargon, king of Akkad, solicitor of Ishtar, king of the universe, anointed priest of An, king of the land, governor of Enlil. He won in battle with Uruk. He conquered the city and tore down its walls, and he captured Lugalzaggesi, king of Uruk, in battle and led him in a neck-stock to the gate of the temple of Enlil." This was an ignominious end for Lugalzaggesi, to be brought in a neck-stock as a prize of war, completely humiliated. Still, Lugalzaggesi had set a precedent by claiming to rule from the upper sea to the lower sea, even if he didn't actually achieve it. And he'd united a group of city-states under his rule. His successor seems to have been influenced by this. Perhaps he wanted to accomplish what Lugalzaggesi had only bragged about. So, who was this Sargon? Well, he says he was the king of Akkad. This was a new city, somewhere to the north of Sumer, in the region where the Tigris and Euphrates flow closest together. Archaeologists haven't found the city of Akkad yet. This area of Mesopotamia came to be called Akkad. The main language spoken there was Akkadian, which was different from the Sumerian spoken in the south. Akkadian is a Semitic language related to modern Arabic and Hebrew. Akkadian began to be written down in Sargon's time using the same cuneiform script, also used to write Sumerian. One common misconception is that Sargon's conquests were some sort of violent ethnic movement of Akkadians into the land of the Sumerians. But there had been Akkadian speakers in Sumer and Sumerian speakers in Akkad for at least as long as people had been writing. We know this from their names. Names back then were all in the form of short sentences or phrases, so it's clear what language they were in. Sargon wouldn't have been perceived as a foreigner by the Sumerians. They were used to Akkadian speakers. The Mesopotamians were prejudiced against some foreigners, like the Gutians who lived in the mountains. But that prejudice didn't extend to one another. Instead, it seems that Akkadian and Sumerian speakers were all us in their minds. Educated people increasingly spoke both languages. So, Sargon was a warrior king who spoke Akkadian. The inscription calls him King of the Land, which was the same title that Lugalzaggesi had taken. But he also called himself something even more impressive. It can be translated as King of the Universe, and there's some debate about the translation, but the term meant something bigger than the land. Was he successful in ruling a larger area than Lugalzaggesi had controlled? Sargon also states that he had relationships with 3 gods. Here he makes some fairly conventional claims. The gods had chosen him to rule his land, and he served them in religious and political roles. It's notable that Sargon says nothing about his father. If he had inherited the throne, presumably he would have said so. His name, Sargon, means the king is legitimate, or true king. This suggests that it wasn't his birth name. Even legitimate crown princes didn't have names like that. He probably adopted it after seizing the throne and conquering Uruk. So his name became part of his propaganda. No one could even mention him by name without basically confirming his right to the throne. What has true king been doing lately? Have you been called up to fight in true king's army? You see what I mean? Long after Sargon's reign, legends grew up around him. It was said that his mother was a priestess who had given birth in secret and set him in a basket on the river, presumably hoping he wouldn't drown and that he would be found by someone and brought up by them. This is a feature of the legendary beginnings of several men who rose from obscurity and became great heroes in the eyes of their people. The same is said to have happened to Moses when he was a baby, and to Romulus and Remus in Rome. It's unclear if this was because the stories were influenced by one another, or if floating unwanted babies down rivers in baskets was a familiar thing to do in a world without orphanages. In any event, we have no way to know if the episode was based in fact. The legend went on to state that a man who drew water out of the river found baby Sargon and brought him up, after which the goddess Ishtar somehow swooped in and made him king. As I said, this was a legend, and legends don't have to make a lot of sense. It does suggest, though, that Sargon's origins were humble, and that he overthrew a legitimate king, almost certainly in the city of Kish, and soon he began shaking things up. Sargon wasn't the kind of ruler who'd be celebrated in the modern world if he appeared today. Modern states and their subjects don't approve of leaders who stage coups, take power, and make unprovoked attacks on their neighbors. But Sargon was remembered by later generations as a great king. He's sometimes even referred to as Sargon the Great, which puts him in the same category as Cyrus, Alexander, Constantine, Herod, and a whole lot of other the great kings, many of whom conquered their neighbors. The later Mesopotamians seem to have almost completely forgotten Lugalzaggesi and all the other Sumerian kings of Lagash and Umma, but Sargon's name and reputation were passed down for thousands of years. In his inscription, Sargon described the cities he conquered as he headed beyond Uruk. First, there was Ur, where he tore down the walls. Ur had been where the rulers were buried with much of their wealth and with sacrificed men and women to serve them in the afterlife. Then he went on to Lagash and continued down to the sea. This was the lower sea, the Persian Gulf. When he got there, he states that he washed his weapons in the sea. This was such a symbolic gesture that it captured the imagination of Sargon's successors. From this time on, a king who claimed to rule all of Mesopotamia often said that he'd washed his weapons in both seas. Sargon used much the same wording as Lugalzaggesi to describe why he'd been successful. He said that Enlil did not give him a rival, but he gave him indeed the upper sea and the lower sea. This took 34 battles, apparently. So there he was, after all his conquests, ruler of an empire. Strictly speaking, this was the world's first empire. The Egyptian kings had ruled an area almost this extensive, at least in length, though not in square miles, for hundreds of years. But Egypt was one country. The people there all spoke the same language, worshipped the same gods, and shared the same culture. The Nile was a natural unifying feature, and ever since about 3000 BCE, the default situation in Egypt was that it was ruled by a single king. This was never true in Mesopotamia, which tended to break up into smaller kingdoms. Sargon's empire was full of people with different traditions, different languages, and a long history of independence. The people Sargon conquered wouldn't have felt automatic allegiance to him. Their loyalty was to their local kingdom. They don't even seem to have thought of themselves as Sumerian or Mesopotamian or Syrian. They thought of themselves as citizens of Mari or Lagash or Ur. So why should they submit to a foreign war leader who had come in and destroyed their buildings and their city walls and then asked them to pay taxes to him? How could he possibly rule them? Think for a minute about the difficulties of ruling an empire back then. Not only were many people probably unhappy about having been conquered, but communication was a very slow business. If something important happened in a distant part of the empire, something like a rebellion, it might take weeks for the news to reach the king in the capital city. Then he'd have to gather his troops and make arrangements to move them to the region and get them on the road. By the time they got there, the rebellion might have been going on for months. The rebellious region might think of itself as completely free from the empire by then. Or what if a town decided not to pay its taxes? Or what if dozens of towns decided not to pay their taxes? How could they be forced to do so? It wouldn't have been possible to punish them quickly to enforce obedience. Everything would be slowed down by the fact that there was no way to move messages any faster than a person could carry them, whether by walking or traveling on a boat. Horses hadn't been domesticated yet. People had domesticated donkeys, but they didn't ride them. We take it for granted now that we can be in instant communication with pretty much anyone, anywhere. It's remarkable, so different from any other era of human history. Not long ago, my husband and I were walking on a remote stretch of the coastal footpath in Cornwall in the United Kingdom, and we were miles away from absolutely anyone else, standing on a headland looking out at the sea. At the same time, we were texting our daughter in the United States to wish her luck on an exam, and she was replying right back as though she were right there with us. Sargon would have been astonished. He was stuck waiting weeks for messages that he had sent to be delivered, and weeks more for the answers to be delivered back to him. So he had to come up with some mechanisms to make this new system work, to ensure that he didn't spend his entire reign leading troops from one place to another, endlessly putting down rebellions. And the ideas that he came up with set a pattern for all later Mesopotamian empires, and after that, for the Persian, Hellenistic, and Roman empires that ruled this same region. Some scholars, including Marlies Heinz, a German archaeologist at the University of Freiburg, have looked at Sargon's reign as a classic example of a successful rebellion against an established order. He did a number of things that a rebel leader often does. Maybe he was the first to do these things. He moved fast in his early conquests, not giving people time to fully realize what was going on. He was quick to put previously powerful leaders into embarrassing and humiliating situations, like dragging poor Lugalzaggesi home in a neck stock. He took away some of the land that traditionally had belonged to temples and sold it or used it as gifts to reward people who supported him. He resettled some people whom he had conquered in new areas. These people might have rebelled against Sargon if they were left in their homelands, but in their new settlements, they would have to focus on making a living, starting new farms, putting meals on the table, so they wouldn't have much energy left to form a resistance movement. Sargon created a new capital that didn't have any old allegiances or traditions. Power was now focused in just one place, his capital city of Akkad, and he could demand the goods he wanted from around the empire as taxes and tribute, rather than paying for them. This was, of course, one of the great advantages of his new system, at least to him and his officials. Enormous amounts of wealth flowed in, and not much flowed out. In one of Sargon's inscriptions, he wrote, "From the lower sea onwards, natives of Akkad are holding the governorships." He was creating a new structure of government. We still have the idea of governors today, people who control a particular area within a larger country. Sargon ousted the old local kings like Lugalzaggesi and put people from Akkad, his own region, in control across the empire. He presumably believed they would be more loyal to him than someone born and raised in the region. This is another characteristic of a successful rebellion, according to Marlies Heinz, the German scholar. Sargon claimed he had supported the gods in this. After all, how could he have been successful if the gods hadn't wanted him to prevail? In each region that he conquered, he said the local god had given him control there, even if he also admitted he'd fought for it. This probably wasn't entirely cynical. He probably believed it himself. His very success proved his legitimacy and demonstrated all the divine support that he had. Only if the gods had chosen him to build the empire could he possibly have succeeded. The people probably believed this as well. It might have made rebelling a little riskier. The gods might be against you if you did it. Then Sargon did a smart thing. He put one of his family members in an important religious post in the south. Ur was one of the greatest of all cities and home to the moon god, whose name was Nana in Sumerian and Sin in Sargon's Akkadian language. The temple of the moon god was huge and wealthy and headed by a powerful high priestess. Ur might well have become a center of resistance against Sargon's new imperial system. So, Sargon appointed his daughter to be the new high priestess of the moon god at Ur. She could keep an eye on things for him politically, while also working to keep the moon god on his side. We don't know what the daughter's original name was, but it would have been an Akkadian name. In Ur, she adopted a Sumerian name, Enheduanna, matching the language of the people there. She was taking on a major role. The high priestess had to appease the god, of course, and to make sure that he, or at least his statue, was fed and clothed and happy. She also had to oversee the administration of his vast estates. Probably a lot of wealth in Ur derived from the temple and its holdings. Another of Sargon's strategies for dominating the world, or at least the world that he knew of, was to have a group of soldiers available year-round. Up until this time, battles were fought when people weren't farming. The men called up for military service were farmers, and they needed to be at home for most of the year. For a few months, though, between harvest and the planting season, they could serve the king. So wars tended to be fairly short. This was okay if you were battling with the neighboring city-state over where the border should be drawn, but not very helpful if you wanted to put down a distant rebellion. In one of Sargon's inscriptions, after listing a series of conquests, he wrote that 5,400 men daily eat in his presence. Historians have speculated that these men were his elite troops, supported and fed by the king. There's a debate among scholars about whether Sargon's conquests really constituted an empire. After all, whatever name you give to the state he created, it didn't last very long. And perhaps we're guilty of buying into Sargon's propaganda about the extent of his power. But a historian at Yale University, Benjamin Foster, has made a convincing argument that it was an empire, and I think he's right. For one thing, Sargon and his successors attempted to standardize a number of things, including the writing system. and he introduced the same type of record-keeping across the empire. Foster also looked at the place names that show up on clay tablets from sites like Lagash. Before Sargon's time, these tablets mostly mentioned local places in Sumer, and they referred to some diplomatic contact with lands to the east, like Elam. After Lagash was conquered by Akkad, all kinds of new places are mentioned in the tablets. Cities as far away as western Syria and Iran, and the countries of Dilmun, Magan, and Meluha. Syria and Iran were within the Akkadian Empire, but Dilmun, Magan, and Meluha were distant lands that Sargon claimed to have ties to. So the tablets found in the ground back up Sargon's claims for his wide conquests and contacts. What he and his successors achieved really was unprecedented. The contact with foreign lands outside the empire also seems to have been more direct than during previous eras. In one of Sargon's inscriptions, he wrote that he moored boats of Meluha, Magan, and Dilmun at the wharf of Agade. Meluha was the Indus Valley, Magan was modern Oman, and Dilmun was centered on the island of Bahrain in the Persian Gulf. These regions had been trading with Mesopotamia for a couple of centuries. We know this because of the precious goods, like carnelian from South Asia, that had been found in early dynastic tombs. But Sargon welcomed the boats from foreign trading partners to his capital with the merchants and their valuable merchandise on board. This seems to have been new. Akkadian trade didn't depend on middlemen. At least one local man made his living as a translator for the foreigners. This man's cylinder seal notes that his name was Sin Elishu, which was an Akkadian name, and that he was a Meluha interpreter. He must have been able to speak Akkadian and the language of the Indus Valley. For now, the Indus Valley script remains undeciphered, and so the language is unknown to us. After Sargon's death, he was succeeded by two sons, one after the other. The first one, Rimush, was faced with rebellions all over the empire, which he had to put down. This was a fairly common occurrence in the ancient world. The transfer of power between kings seems to have been an ideal time to break away from their control. Rimush's brother, Manishtushu, took over next. He too was a fighter. He put together a fleet of ships and campaigned in Magan, modern Oman. He claimed in an inscription that 32 cities of Magan assembled for war, and he vanquished them and smote their cities. He felled their rulers and captured their fugitives as far as the silver mines. So, Sargon's successors kept right on fighting, trying to expand their areas of control. Sargon, as founder of the empire, had created the mold for what it meant to be an emperor.